Welcome back to True Echo, where real stories echo louder than fiction. Today's story is one of heartbreak, brilliance, and a girl who turned humiliation into history. When a young girl was mocked during her piano audition and told she didn't belong, no one expected what would happen next. But when the lights went out, her music lit up the world. This is a story that will break you, rebuild you, and leave you speechless. So grab your headphones, turn up the volume, and stay with us, because you won't want to miss a single note of Eva Monroe's extraordinary journey. You don't belong here, dear. The words echoed across the marble hall of Aldebridge Academy like a knife slicing through velvet. Headmistress Clara Hemsley stood at the front of the stage, her arms crossed over a cashmere shawl, lips twisted into a smile so precise it felt rehearsed. She barely looked at the girl in front of her, a skinny thing in a faded blue dress, gripping a frayed folder of handwritten sheet music like a shield. Her name was Eva Monroe. And this was her dream. Eva had spent months saving bus fare, months practicing on plastic keys taped to a cardboard box. She hadn't come with tutors or formal letters of recommendation. She came with a melody, hers and her mother's, and a heart full of fire. But to Clara Hemsley, that meant nothing. You've had formal training, I presume. Clara's voice carried a chill, drawing quiet laughter from the other students. Girls in pressed uniforms. Boys in designer shoes. Polished, posed, powerful. Eva shook her head. No, ma'am. But I. Clara cut her off. Stop wasting our time. Eva swallowed hard. She looked out at the judging panel. No one defended her. Not even the balding man with the gold spectacles, who looked vaguely embarrassed but said nothing. The piano bench called to her like a raft in a storm. But before she could sit down, Clara's voice sliced through again. Your posture's all wrong. You'll embarrass yourself. There's dignity in knowing when you're not meant for something. The laughter now wasn't stifled. It rolled across the auditorium like thunder. Eva's hands trembled as she clutched her music closer. She wanted to vanish. But instead, she turned and walked. Backstage, the air was cooler. The light dimmer. She kept her head down as she moved through a hallway lined with forgotten doors and locked practice rooms. Her cheeks burned. And that's when she heard it, a whisper. Eva. She turned. It was Mr. Rowan, the janitor. 60 years old, with eyes full of gentle stories and a mop in his hand. He had seen her earlier that day. He had offered her a sandwich when she sat alone outside the academy gates, soaked in rain, waiting for the doors to open. You came all this way, he said. Don't stop now. They laughed at me, she whispered. Rowan nodded. They don't know what they're hearing. But I've heard it. In your humming. In your silence. Come with me. He led her through a rusted stairwell and down into a corridor so old the academy barely acknowledged it existed. At the end was a room warped by time, filled with cracked mirrors and dusty portraits. In the center stood an upright piano. Dull. Mismatched keys. One leg shorter than the others. It still plays, Rowan said. And sometimes, that's all you need. He left her there. Eva sat. No lights. No judges. Just the sound of wind moaning through broken vents and her mother's voice in her memory, breathe in. Remember the melody. Let it tell your story. She closed her eyes and played. Eva's fingers pressed softly against the worn keys, and the first notes trembled like a whispered secret in the dark. She didn't play from the paper. She didn't even open her sheet music. The melody came from somewhere deeper, somewhere buried beneath years of silence, beneath floors scrubbed clean by calloused hands and songs hummed only in private. Outside the forgotten room, the storm raged louder. Thunder rolled over the academy like a drumbeat of defiance. But inside that space, surrounded by dust, cracked mirrors, and portraits no one had looked at in decades, her music took shape. The piano's voice was rough, imperfect. Some keys stuck, others rang out too sharply. But it didn't matter. Because what poured from her hands wasn't performance, it was confession. A story without words. A grief no one had asked to hear, but one that demanded to be felt. She played the lullabies her mother once whispered. The ones that made her feel like the world was still good, even after the machines in the hospital went quiet. She played the notes she'd taught herself on kitchen counters and park benches, using her breath as rhythm and her memories as metronome. And without knowing it, she played into silence. Because just then, in the polished, cold auditorium upstairs, the power failed. A flicker. Then black. A gasp moved through the seated audience like a single intake of breath. Chandeliers dimmed. Emergency lights sputtered and died. For a moment, everything was still. Confused murmurs. Nervous laughter. Judges tapping at dead screens. Clara Hemsley rising slowly from her seat. "This is unacceptable," she hissed. "Where's maintenance?" But then, over the murmur, faint at first, came a sound. Music. Not coming from the stage. Not from the speakers. From somewhere else entirely. A melody tiptoed into the room, winding through the vents and floorboards like smoke through cracks. Gentle, aching, alive. It began as a curiosity. Heads turned. Ears strained. Then it became undeniable. Someone was playing. One of the judges, the one with the spectacles, stood up slowly. "Is this?" But no one could answer. Because no one knew. All they knew was that it wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't on the schedule. It wasn't coming from any of the polished grand pianos in the main hall. And yet, it was the most human, breathtaking sound to ever slip through those pristine walls. Clara stood still now, her mouth slightly open, her carefully curated expression faltering. She turned toward the wings of the stage, as though trying to catch the direction of the music. But the sound came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off marble and crawling beneath the soles of designer shoes. The lights stayed off. The storm howled. But the music played on. Back in the sub-hallway, Eva never opened her eyes. She didn't know she had an audience. She didn't know that her hands, tired, trembling, stained from cleaning solutions and long walks in the rain, were commanding the silence of an entire academy. She didn't know the judges had stood. Or that the students, the ones who laughed, now sat in stunned quiet. She only knew the piano. And what it had been waiting to say. And then, slowly, the lights returned. A flicker. Then the chandeliers lit, one by one, casting soft gold across shocked faces. The judges looked to one another in disbelief. The students stayed silent. Even Clara Hemsley had lost her words. And then, someone moved. A tech student near the back corner tapped the old surveillance system panel. Static. Then a feed flickered on. A grainy camera from an old backstage corridor. A girl. A piano. Her. Projected on the screen at the back of the hall was Eva Monroe, seated at an upright piano beneath a single, flickering bulb. Her ponytail slipped across her cheek. Her hands danced across mismatched keys. Her eyes closed. But her music, it blazed. Clara Hemsley turned, staring at the screen. She didn't move. Couldn't. And then the oldest judge, the woman with silver braids and a notebook full of musical shorthand, whispered, "That's not technique. That's truth." From behind the curtain, a door creaked open wider. The audience in the main hall stirred. The camera feed remained projected. And still, Eva played. Until, at last, her final note faded like a held breath finally released. Her hands hovered above the keys, then fell gently into her lap. And the world stood still. A voice, quiet and reverent, broke the silence. "Eva Monroe," said the judge from Juilliard, stepping forward. You just played your way in. The applause came slowly at first, unsure if they were allowed. Then it grew, wild, unrestrained. A standing ovation in a hall that had been frozen in tradition. Clara Hemsley remained still. Her kingdom had cracked, not from rebellion, but from a lullaby in the dark. Eva turned to the doorway, startled by the sudden presence of so many people, judges, students, staff, all standing there, watching her like she had stepped out of a legend. She clutched her music sheets, unsure what to do. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt seen. The judge from Juilliard stepped forward again. Would you join us on stage? Eva looked at the same platform she'd been chased off hours earlier. She nodded. She rose. And the girl who had been told she didn't belong walked into the light, her truth ringing louder than any rule. Eva walked down the same hallway that had once swallowed her in shame, but this time, she didn't shrink. She didn't clutch her music like armor or tuck her chin to avoid their eyes. She walked slowly, the echo of her steps mingling with whispers of awe that trailed behind her. When she stepped into the main auditorium, the chandeliers glowed brighter than before. Not because of the bulbs, but because the room itself seemed to recognize her now, not as an outsider, but as a voice that had spoken something sacred. The judges were waiting near the edge of the stage. The Juilliard representative, still holding a clipboard he no longer looked at, nodded once. Eva Monroe, he said again, this time louder, your audition will never be forgotten. A murmur of agreement passed among the panel. Even the silver-haired judge, Mrs. Langford, as Eva would later learn, stood and offered a rare, approving smile. But Clara Hemsley? She stood just behind the judges, her spine stiff, hands folded too tightly, mouth drawn in a delicate, unshakable smile. The same kind of smile that once held power. But now, it looked hollow. Porcelain over a fault line. Let's not get too carried away, Clara said smoothly, her voice like glass laid over gravel. Miss Monroe, while your display was certainly moving, it did breach protocol. Playing without clearance, unscheduled access to school property. She saved the evening, Mrs. Langford interrupted. She broke rules, Clara pressed. And rewrote expectations, the Juilliard judge said. There it was. A line in the sand. Eva watched the exchange, silent. Torn between fear and defiance. Then Mr. Rowan stepped forward. Still in his maintenance uniform, mop streaked across his shoulder, eyes full of stories. He hadn't been invited to the conversation, but in that moment, no one dared stop him. I've worked here 22 years, Rowan said softly. Heard every etude, every concerto, every show-off playing for applause. He nodded toward Eva. But what she played? That wasn't a performance. That was truth. And truth don't need a stage pass. A hush fell again. Clara stared at him like he had burned down her library. But she didn't reply. Because what could she say? The judges turned back to Eva. Do you write music? Asked Mrs. Langford. Eva hesitated. Not, officially. The man with the gold spectacles smiled. Then it's time you start. Later that evening, a formal offer arrived, full scholarship, housing assistance, mentorship. Not just a seat in the school, but a path. A beginning. And Clara Hemsley? She signed the paperwork, yes. She followed procedure. But her signature dragged across the page like regret. The next morning, Eva returned to the campus not as a visitor, not as a janitor's guest, but as a student. Still in her thrifted blue dress. Still clutching her music folder. Orientation was a blur of names and expectations. Clara led the session with her usual grace. Talent, she announced to the room of elite students, is only the beginning. What matters most is discipline. Structure. Obedience. A few eyes drifted toward Eva. Not all curious. some resentful. When orientation ended, Eva stayed back, organizing her schedule. That's when Madeline Carrington approached, tall, composed, her crimson lipstick as sharp as her tone. "You're the basement girl," she said, her voice wrapped in silk and disdain. Eva nodded once, careful. "Room B12 is mine, right?" Madeline smirked. "Was. There's been a correction." She handed Eva a slip of paper. "You've been reassigned. Sub-basement. Room E7. Eva took it slowly. The ink looked fresh. Clara's initials in the corner. "No one really uses that room," Madeline added. "Good luck with the rats." Eva said nothing. She simply turned and walked away. The steps down to the sub-basement creaked. Paint peeled from the walls. A chill hugged her arms as she reached room E7. A piano sat beneath a flickering bulb, its bench crooked, one key missing entirely. She sat anyway. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She played. Because even buried beneath sabotage and silence, music could still rise. By the third day, whispers had already begun. Someone had heard music drifting through the vents. Someone else had followed it and sat outside her door. They didn't speak to her, not yet, but they stayed. They listened. On the fifth day, a violinist knocked, gently, and asked, "May I?" She nodded. They played, together, quietly. On the seventh day, a note appeared on her door. Slipped between the cracks. No signature. "Stay in your place." Eva stared at the note for a long time. Then she folded it in half. And placed it beneath the missing key on the piano. She sat. And played louder. The days passed, but the air at Aldebridge Academy remained heavy. Eva played in E7 like it was a chapel, even if the bench wobbled and the walls wept cold through the plaster. What started as secret melodies in the dark had become a quiet ritual, one that began to draw unexpected followers. First, it was two first-year cellists who lingered outside her door between classes, pretending to study while listening. Then came a girl from the vocal department who asked Eva to transcribe one of her melodies, not because she understood it, but because she couldn't forget it. By the end of the second week, her music was no longer invisible. It slipped under doors, drifted through vents, and climbed the staircases like steam. They didn't always say her name aloud. But they whispered. They felt something shifting. And Clara Hemsley noticed. She didn't acknowledge it directly. That wasn't her style. But her presence loomed heavier during weekly evaluations. Her gaze lingered longer on the new girl's name. And her speeches to the student body became more severe. "Talent is fire," Clara would say, standing in front of the gleaming auditorium. But even fire destroys when it escapes its flame. Then came the midterm showcase, the most anticipated performance event of the season. Donors attended. Conservatory scouts made appearances. Scholarships and career tracks often began or ended there. Eva didn't expect to be invited. But she was. Not by Clara, by the judges. Mrs. Langford had insisted. "She plays what others fake," she said plainly to the board. "Let her have a slot in the second act. The scouts won't forget her." Clara hadn't fought it, not openly. She simply nodded, smiled faintly, and said, "Of course. Let's make it memorable." 2 days before the performance, Eva received a note in her locker. Final rehearsal moved to room A1 at 2 p.m. Admin. Room A1, the performance prep hall, adjacent to the main stage. A luxury practice room equipped with the Academy's newest Steinway, typically reserved for the elite. She almost couldn't believe her luck. At 1:57 p.m., she stood outside the gleaming double doors of room A1, hands slightly damp, heart pounding. She pushed the door open. It was dark. At first, she thought it was just early. Then something brushed past her shoulder, fast, unseen. The lights flickered on. And what she saw hollowed her out. The Steinway was destroyed. Its strings had been slashed with a razor, snapped like nerves. The hammers were misaligned, its casing cracked, keys chipped. It looked like a carcass of something once holy. Eva staggered backward. Then came the voice. A slow, sultry venom from behind. "Oh no," said Madeline Carrington, leaning against the frame with arms crossed and a familiar smirk. "Looks like someone's out of luck." Eva couldn't speak. Madeline stepped forward casually, examining the damage like a gallery piece. "You should have known better. Clara says the stage is a privilege, not a playground for charity cases." "You did this," Eva whispered. No. But I guess no one really knows where the damage came from, do they?" She smiled. "Maybe it was old. Maybe it was, mishandled." Tears burned behind Eva's eyes. Not because of the sabotage. But because she'd let herself believe, for one moment, that she was safe here. Madeline leaned in close. "You don't belong. You weren't meant to last. You were meant to be a moment." Then she turned and walked away. Eva stood there in the wreckage, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the storm building outside. The piano wasn't just a tool. It was her partner. Her voice. And they had killed it. She stumbled through the corridors until she reached the West Wing, eyes blurred, shoulders shaking. Rain now fell hard outside, angry, loud, unfiltered. She sat under the stone archway near the courtyard, coat soaked, knees pulled to her chest. The cold bit through her sleeves. But it couldn't reach her deeper than this ache already had. That's where Rowan found her. "You're drenched," he said gently, holding out an old sweatshirt from the janitor's closet. She didn't take it. "They broke the piano," she whispered. "They broke everything." Rowan said nothing for a moment. Then he crouched down beside her. "Then play something else." "I don't have another piano." "Yes, you do," he said. And he stood, motioning her to follow. Eva hesitated, then rose. He led her through a door marked "Renovation Area, Do Not Enter." The west wing of the school was under reconstruction, shut for years, unused and silent. At the end of a long corridor was a room she'd never seen. Rowan unlocked the chained door with a silver key. Inside, dust, shadow, and something sacred. An old grand piano. Covered in velvet. Untouched for decades. This was Langford's, Rowan said. She begged them not to throw it out when the wing was shut. She knew someone would need it again. Eva stepped closer. She pulled off the tarp. It was scratched. Weathered. But whole. She placed her fingers on the keys. They responded, even out of tune, soft, open, waiting. "This one's yours," Rowan said. "At least for tonight." She didn't ask questions. She sat. And played. All night. No sheet music. No rules. No audience. Only her. Only truth. The morning of the midterm showcase arrived with a strange hush hanging over the academy, as though the building itself had paused to hold its breath. Outside, the last of the storm clouds melted into pale blue. Inside, the grand auditorium sparkled. Donors took their seats in velvet rows. Faculty arranged their programs. Scouts from Juilliard, the New York Conservatory, and even foreign conservatories filled the back 2 rows, murmuring behind notebooks and clipped accents. Eva stood alone backstage, tucked behind a curtain, her palms slightly trembling, not from fear, but from something bigger, defiance. She'd been awake for nearly 30 hours. Practicing. On the old piano in the West Wing. The one that had waited in silence for years, gathering dust like a secret. Now, it was hers. Just like the song she had written, unintentionally, unknowingly, note by aching note over the last few months. Each performer that evening was polished, poised, dressed in gowns worth more than Eva's entire wardrobe. Some were flawless. But none were unforgettable. Until the announcer stepped forward at the podium. "And now," he said, his voice echoing through the vast hall, "a special performance. A solo composition by Eva Monroe." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some students stiffened in their seats. Madeline's smile vanished. Clara Hemsley looked straight ahead, lips pressed tight. And Eva stepped out. She didn't walk to the Steinway at center stage. She passed it. And then, another spotlight flared to life, stage left. The forgotten grand from the West Wing had been wheeled out, its scratches and aged frame still intact, now gleaming with polish Rowan had applied by hand that morning. Its presence was unexpected. Undeniable. A murmur moved across the crowd like wind. Eva sat at the bench. She didn't look up. Didn't bow. She just played. And what came out of that piano was not the lullaby from before. It wasn't even the piece the judges had approved for her slot. It was new. It was rebellion in the language of beauty. It was a protest composed in grace. The first notes were like breaths, fragile, cautious, but behind them burned a lifetime. She poured her mother into the keys. She poured rain-soaked mornings, rejection, loneliness, silence, kindness, and every "you don't belong here" she'd ever heard into the music. And the audience felt it. Not understood it, felt it. The scouts stopped writing. One closed his eyes. The violinist who had once rehearsed with her in secret stood from his seat and began to cry silently. Mrs. Langford sat in stillness, hand over her heart. And Clara Hemsley? She did not blink. Her hand gripped the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. Her eyes never left Eva, but something behind them cracked, just for a moment. Because she recognized it, too. The truth. The talent she had tried to crush. And now it was blooming in front of everyone she wanted to impress. The final note came like the hush before prayer. Eva's hands hovered over the keys. Then gently lowered into her lap. The auditorium erupted. But Eva stayed seated, chest rising and falling, eyes closed. Not savoring applause. Breathing. When she finally stood, her head bowed not to the crowd, but to the piano. She walked off stage quietly. In the wings, Mrs. Langford was already waiting, tears clinging to her lower lashes. "You didn't just perform," she said. "You rewrote the room." Eva nodded. "I just played." Langford smiled. "Exactly." Backstage became a blur. Scouts asked for her name again. One handed her a card with the words, "Winter Gala, New York Conservatory," scrawled beneath his contact. But Eva didn't pocket it with glee. She simply held it like something sacred, fragile. Because part of her still wasn't sure if this was real. Madeline passed her once. No words. Just disbelief flickering in her carefully lined eyes. Clara? She didn't return backstage. She slipped away as the audience rose to its feet. Like applause might burn her skin. The next morning, Eva awoke in her dorm, still tucked behind the janitor's wing, with a knock at the door. A man in a blazer handed her a thick envelope. She opened it with cautious fingers. The New York Conservatory of Fine Arts Winter Honors Gala. "Miss Eva Monroe, you are hereby invited to perform as a featured soloist." Her hands trembled. Her throat tightened. She turned the letter over, unsure how to breathe. Then, just as she began to dial Rowan's number, another letter slid under the door. No knock. Just silence. Typed. Formal. From Clara. Eva. Given the unusual nature of your scholarship and the disruptions tied to your admission, I regret to inform you that your solo opportunities within the school's programs will be temporarily suspended pending a review of protocol violations. While some may celebrate your unconventional journey, order must be maintained. Respectfully. Headmistress Clara Hemsley. The two letters sat side by side. One an invitation. One a warning. One a door wide open. The other a wall quickly built. Eva stared at both in silence. And something deep inside her settled, not in defeat, but in decision. She folded Clara's letter and set it aside. Then she picked up the invitation to New York. And began to pack. The train to New York cut through snowy hills like a slow, humming sonata. Eva sat by the window, her satchel resting on her lap, one hand gripping the conservatory's letter as if it might vanish if she let go. She hadn't told many she was leaving. Rowan knew, of course. He had hugged her tightly outside the academy gates, whispered, "Play like the lights might go out again," and handed her a small notebook of lined pages, saying, "Write your own." Mrs. Langford knew too. She had given her a scarf, navy blue, embroidered with a single treble clef on the edge. "For luck," she said. "And legacy." The city rose before her like a crescendo, steel and glass lit with the golden gleam of winter dusk. It was exactly as her mother had once described, restless, magnificent, unforgiving, and alive. At the station, a man in a tailored coat met her. "Miss Monroe?" he asked. "Yes," she answered, almost unsure it was still her name. "Dean Ashton Rivers," he said, offering a warm handshake. "We've been waiting for you." The car ride passed in silence. Eva watched Manhattan unfold beyond the glass, its corners brimming with stories, its streets humming with movement. When they pulled up to the New York Conservatory of Fine Arts, Eva felt her breath catch. It wasn't a school. It was a monument. Stone columns. Carved instruments above arched windows. The sound of music, real music, leaking out like perfume. "You'll rehearse tomorrow," Dean Rivers said as he showed her to her room. "Tonight, rest. This place can feel like too much at first." "It already does," she whispered. The room was small, but the window overlooked the snow-covered courtyard. She stood for a long time, watching students pass beneath glowing lamps, coats pulled tight, laughter clouding the air. She didn't sleep much. At dawn, she found herself seated at a pristine grand piano in the East Wing rehearsal space, waiting for someone to arrive. A woman entered quietly. 60-something. Silver braid trailing down her back. She moved like someone who had danced once and never quite stopped. "You're early," she said. "I didn't want to be late," Eva replied. The woman smiled without looking up. "Your hands, how do they feel today?" "Strong," Eva said. A half lie. They trembled slightly. But the music inside her felt louder than the nerves. "Good," said the woman, finally meeting her eyes. "Because they carry more than notes." Only then did her expression shift into something more personal. "My name is Marianne Rowan," she said. "I was your mother's teacher." Eva froze. "She never told me," she whispered. "She couldn't," Marianne replied gently. "The scholarship was withdrawn when she got pregnant. Her family cut her off. She had to leave. But she never stopped playing. She used to send me tapes, recordings of lullabies. Some were for her. But most were for you." Eva's hands shook harder now. "You knew about me?" "Only pieces. Until your name appeared on the showcase list." Marianne stepped closer. "She would have been proud, Eva. Not just because you got here, but because you kept playing when no one was listening." For the first time in years, Eva cried without hiding her face. They rehearsed together every day for the next 2. Not with scales or rigid drills, but with intention. With heart. Eva chose to perform one of the lullabies her mother had recorded on tape, one she had only half remembered until Marianne filled in the missing chords. It was not grand. Not complex. But it carried a soul. The night of the Winter Honors Gala arrived with snow swirling around the conservatory's great doors like a curtain about to rise. Inside, gold chandeliers sparkled above an audience of critics, composers, and dignitaries. Dean Rivers stepped onto the stage. "Tonight," he said, "we welcome a rising voice. A composer who reminds us why we fell in love with music in the first place." He didn't say her name yet. He didn't have to. Eva stepped out in a deep navy gown, the same color as the scarf Langford had given her. Her shoes were simple. Her walk was quiet. But her presence made the audience still. She sat. The lights softened. She placed her fingers on the keys. And played. Not the showcase piece. Not the rebellious fire from Aldebridge. This was a lullaby. For her mother. For the girl on the stone bench in the rain. For the boy in the back of the classroom who hums to himself so he doesn't feel alone. The melody unfolded like breath. No performance. Just presence. When she finished, there was no immediate applause. Just silence. Full. Sacred. Then the crowd stood. A roar of ovation. Marianne wept in the front row. Dean Rivers nodded from the side. And Eva? She bowed once, hand pressed to her heart. Not for the applause. But for the music. For where it had taken her. And for where it would still go. Snow blanketed the steps of Aldebridge Academy when Eva returned weeks later. She walked through the front gates with her coat tight around her shoulders and a worn satchel in hand. Her boots left quiet imprints along the marble hallway. This time, she wasn't a hopeful. She wasn't even a student. She was a name now. A performance. A presence that even the headmistress couldn't erase. Students passed her with widened eyes. Some whispered. Others smiled, unsure if they were allowed to. Eva didn't stop. She walked toward the old practice wings, past portraits that once seemed to watch her with disapproval. Now, they just looked, distant. At room E7, a folded paper was taped to the door. No name. But the handwriting was unmistakable. "There's a performance next week. You won't be stopped this time. CH." Eva stared at it for a long time. Then, with steady fingers, she removed the note and folded it carefully, placing it in her satchel. The winter showcase loomed, and this time, it was hers to open. Clara Hemsley sat in the front row again, her posture as regal as ever. But the lines around her mouth had softened. The students beside her didn't watch her like a monarch now. They glanced at her the way people do when they wonder if they're witnessing change. Eva stood backstage with a scarf around her neck and calluses still faintly on her fingers. Langford waited beside her. "You sure you're ready?" she asked. Eva smiled. "I never stopped being." The lights dimmed. Her name was announced. She stepped into the light. This time, there was no confusion, no protest. No detour. She sat at the Steinway in the center of the stage. Not the back corner. Not the basement. Not hidden behind doubt. Center stage. The audience waited. And she gave them everything. The piece she played was new. Born from a melody her mother never got to finish. Shaped by nights in forgotten rooms. Colored by sorrow, rebellion, hope. It was not loud. It was not grandiose. But it moved through the air like truth, brushing against old wounds and reminding people what it meant to feel something before understanding it. When the final note faded, no one stood right away. They didn't need to. They sat in silence, the kind that comes after a story ends, when no one wants to be the first to speak. Then the applause began, steady, reverent, real. Clara Hemsley didn't clap. But she didn't leave. She stayed seated, hands folded, her expression unreadable. When Eva stepped off stage, Langford was waiting with a hug and a whisper, I think you just changed this place. Eva smiled. Not me. The music. That night, back in her room, a small girl waited by the edge of the courtyard. The same girl who had once whispered in the church, "She sounds like dreams." Eva knelt beside her again. "Did you listen?" The girl nodded. "I want to play, too." Eva handed her the same sheet of music she always carried with her now, her mother's lullaby, transcribed by hand, line by line. "When you're ready," she said, "start here." In the following weeks, the academy's lower wings filled with music. More students played in room E7. More benches were repaired. More dust was cleared from old spaces that once held voices too small to be heard. And slowly, very slowly, the walls began to listen. Eva launched a program through the conservatory, the Lullaby Project. Free instruments. Free lessons. Free sheet music for any student in underserved neighborhoods who had a melody but no means. It started with 5 pianos. Then 15. Then schools across the country began requesting her. Everywhere she went, Eva asked the same question, "Who's been playing in silence?" Years later, back at Aldabridge, the school's nameplate outside the practice wing changed. Below the original engraving, a new plaque had been placed. The Eva Monroe Studio for Music Without Permission. And in the far corner of the room sat the old West Wing piano. Still scratched. Still sacred. Still playing. Sometimes the world will try to define your worth by your clothes, your address, your silence. But Eva Monroe reminds us that greatness doesn't come from permission, it comes from persistence. From the broken piano. The basement. The breath between forgotten notes. Let this story remind you. Even if they don't clap. Even if they laugh. Even if the stage is stolen. Play anyway. Because your voice might be the one they never saw coming. This is True Echo, where every untold story deserves to be heard. Subscribe for more real, powerful journeys like this one. And let us know in the comments, what's your melody, and who tried to silence it? We're listening.